Madam President, recently there have been numerous articles in the media about the U.S. Navy's lack of amphibious ships. One that I would like to submit for the record, headline, "Grounding of U.S. Marine Unit Spots the Lack of Ships in the Asia Pacific."
Objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In this piece, the writer leads with how the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, a rapid response force of the Marine Corps designed for quick deployment on 3 Navy ships, what we call an amphibious ready group, how they were forced to abandon a training exercise because the amphibious warships that they're supposed to train on were not available due to maintenance problems. Here's what the article said in part: the Marine unit's grounded status illustrates the larger obstacles the U.S. is facing as it tries to pivot its military to handle the challenges from China. Overall, defense officials said the Navy doesn't have enough amphibious ships to transport Marines. An essential part of the Marine Corps' mission is to hop from island to island in the Asia Pacific and harry Chinese forces in the event of a conflict. By the way, Mr. President, the Marines are really good at this. They've been doing it for decades. But they need ships. Another article from Defense News is also a recent one about the lack of amphibious ships and the problem that poses. This one, Mr. President, is from another part of the world, but very recent. The article starts with how hundreds of American citizens were stranded in war-torn Sudan. It says, quote, "Hundreds of Americans in war-torn Sudan last month needed a way out of the country. But the U.S. Marine Corps, the go-to service for such rescues of American citizens, could not help." The article continued, "Typically, this kind of mission would be standard for the Navy and Marine Corps' amphibious ready groups, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, or what we call in the Marine Corps a MU, ARG, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, an amphibious ready group. 3 ships, super well-trained, special operations capable, can go anywhere in the world, kick the door in, save American citizens." The article continues, "But for the Americans who fled the coast in Sudan, the Pentagon sent an auxiliary transport ship that they contracted out, I believe, from another country to shuttle them safely to Saudi Arabia. It was, in essence, a self-evacuation of U.S. citizens." Mr. President, NPR reported that the buses actually took hundreds of Americans to the port of Sudan. Imagine, my colleagues, what would have happened had those Americans traveling in contract buses in the middle of a civil war got caught in the crossfire. The article that I just quoted, Mr. President, was entitled "Marines Want 31 Amphibious Ships. The Pentagon Disagrees. Now What?" And I'd like to submit that for the record.
Without objection. Thank you, sorry.
And finally, Mr. President, there was another recent article from the Defense News, and its title was "The Navy is on Path to Violate the 31 Amphibious Requirements for Amphib Ships in 2024. Now, Mr. President, this is what I wanted to get to. Last year, in the Armed Services Committee, we held a number of hearings with the Navy and the Marine Corps saying, what is the minimum number of amphibious ships that would enable the Marine Corps to do its global force response mission? The minimum number. After many hearings, after much discussion with the Marines and Navy, we came up in a bill of mind with a minimum of 31 ships. Mr. President, this bill in the Armed Services Committee last year passed unanimously. Every Democrat and every Republican voted for it. The law now reads as follows. I know this is a little small, but here's the new United States Code that has the new language. It says, the naval combat forces of the U.S. Navy shall include not less than 11 operational aircraft carriers and not less than 31 operational amphibious warships, of which not less than 10 shall be amphibious assault ships. Well, we call them the Marine Corps big deck assault ships that can carry helicopters and Ospreys and Harriers and now F-35 Bravos. That was the law. That passed. The President signed it. Here's the problem, Mr. President. The United States Navy is violating the law. The United States Navy is treating that law, 31 amphibs, a minimum, as a suggestion from the Congress, as an option from the Congress. How do I know? Because we had a hearing 2 weeks ago on the Armed Services Committee, and the Secretary of the Navy essentially said, we're looking at different options for the President's budget on how many amphibs that the Navy is going to have. And currently, the Navy presented a budget that doesn't have 31 amphibs. I had some crosswords with the Secretary of the Navy, the CNO of the Navy, because they're violating the law. And I will tell you, Mr. President, my Democratic and Republican colleagues on the Armed Services Committee were supportive of what I was saying. We had a hearing on the Armed Services Readiness Subcommittee yesterday. The Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Franchetti, said that the Navy was, quote, studying the issue. Mr. President, the Navy can't study the issue anymore. The Navy needs to follow the law. The United States Congress has done the studies. We need the ships. But here's what the Navy presented to the Armed Services Committee 2 weeks ago. They provided us their 30-year shipbuilding plan for the Navy. Right here is the 31 amphib ship statutory minimum that is required by the law. Here's the Navy shipbuilding plan for the next 30 years. You're seeing the numbers. These are different options, Plan 1, Plan 2, Plan 3. You might notice the Navy never gets to 31 amphibs. So the Secretary of the Navy, the CNO of the Navy, the Vice CNO of the Navy came to the Congress in the past 2 weeks and said, your 31 amphib ship requirement, we're going to ignore it. Your 31 amphib ship requirement, Congress of the United States of America, we're going to violate that. Mr. President, this is unacceptable. The United States Navy, the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of Defense should not be thumbing their nose at the Congress. And worse, they should not be violating the law and not trying to abide by the law. They're saying for 30 years, we are going to ignore the Congress and we are going to ignore the laws of the United States of America. This cannot happen. This cannot happen. Mr. President, let me end with this. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you are a hawk on defense issues or a dove on defense issues, if you are a United States Senator, this should make you really mad. This should make you really mad. Last year, the Congress spoke, and again, on the Armed Services Committee, on which I serve, it was unanimous. Every member of that committee who'd studied the issue said, at a minimum, the Navy needs 31 amphibs so the U.S. Marine Corps can do its mission around the world. Everybody agreed. We passed the law. The Navy, the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of Defense are thumbing their nose at this body, are breaking the law as we speak, are intending to break the law for the next 30 years. That's their 30-year shipbuilding plan. Never hits 31 ships. But here's the worst thing they're doing, Mr. President. And this is a real serious issue. They're putting the lives of American citizens at risk. Why do I mean that? Well, let me end where I began. Sudan, rescue of American citizens. Again, normally that is a mission tailor-made for the United States Marine Corps, whether in an embassy or another part of a dangerous part of the world. It's what we call a non-combatant evacuation operation, a NEO. The Marines do them all the time. Bring up their amphibs, launch helos, launch support craft, helicopters, fighters if they need the air support. The capability of a MEU-ARG to go rescue American citizens, a lot of them is unsurpassed by any service in the world. The U.S. Marines do it all the time. But guess what they can't do it without, Mr. President? They can't do it without amphibious ships. And right now, we don't have enough. So we dodged a bullet 2 weeks ago in Sudan. American citizens put on buses and driven across dangerous parts of Sudan in a civil war for hours after hours and got to a port, self-evacuated on some other country's ships. We are so lucky that those Americans did not get killed or wounded. Did not get killed or wounded because there was no Marine Corps to rescue them. So, Mr. President, I'm going to keep raising this issue. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, today they are violating the law. Today they have no intention of meeting this 31 amphib ship requirement, and American citizens are at risk. And the next time, we might not be so lucky. The next time Americans somewhere around the world need to be rescued, the next time an enemy of our country does something nefarious to our citizens or our national interests, and we don't have the ability to respond as a Marine Corps because we don't have the ships, we're going to know who's responsible. I yield the floor.
Under the previous